Hello, and welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Last month, we were focused on teachers and gurus, the great benefits of a healthy teacher-student relationship, as well as the pitfalls that we need to watch out for when we're seeking out our spiritual guides. This month's guest speaker, the Jungian psychoanalyst and Buddhist teacher Paula Young Eisendrath, speaks very eloquently on this subject. The fact that teachers are, after all, imperfect beings, just like us, but with hopefully more clarity and skill. Sometimes teachers import their own neuroses and their own needs into their teaching when they don't do enough of their own psychological healing, as Paula explains, very, very well in our interview. In cases like that, students are confronted by a hard choice, whether to trust themselves and take a step back from the teacher, or to keep faith with what they've been told, including what may seem incorrect or even delusional on the part of their teachers. That can be a very hard choice to make. Confronted with evidence of questionable beliefs or even abuse, students may resort to various forms of self-deception, including what's called magical thinking, and tell themselves stories or hide behind fantasy as a way of protecting their loyalties to the teacher or to the creed, and avoiding making choices for themselves. Now, the same tendency toward delusion appears in many areas of spiritual life. In fact, fantasy and magical thinking thrive especially well in the realm of spirituality and religion, precisely because spiritual experience is completely subjective. It's mostly hidden from view and silent. So if I report having had a mystical or a religious experience, for example, there's no way to prove that this is untrue, no matter how far-fetched the details might appear. The fact that spiritual experience can't be confirmed or disproved is precisely what drives non-believers so crazy. Take Sam Harris, whose work you may know, and I respect Sam a lot. He wrote a book called The End of Faith, and he complains that matters of faith are exempt from reason. They're exempt from having to make any sense or be proved in a way that no other part of our life is. Harris notes that you can challenge a person's politics, his taste, his choices in all areas of life, but challenging a person's beliefs is taboo. It's considered offensive, even morally wrong. That's where the phrase sacred cow comes from. If you happen to have my book, Ethical Wisdom, have a look at the last section. It's on sacredness and purity and why our brains have evolved this need for transcendent connection or faith. And when you understand how deeply rooted, how hardwired it is in our brains to have this transcendent connection, you come to understand why people respond so forcefully, sometimes violently, when you start poking at their sacred cows with questions. Now, since spiritual life is beyond comprehension, and the mind can't contain it, seekers get away with great gaps in discernment, very often, gaps that are sometimes called leaps of faith. Even in a practice like meditation, where brain waves can be measured to prove the alteration, the chemical and neurological alteration in our brain, we can't judge the quality or the spiritual validity of the meditator's experience. And if that's true of something as observable as meditation, just imagine how impossible it is to challenge more abstract spiritual practices. This explains why superstitions that we inherit from family and from our culture, you could call them traditional forms of magical thinking, require no basis in truth to exist. They only require that we trust those who teach it to us. And that's how we have these second-hand beliefs that we haven't tested against our own experience. And it's also why some spiritual teachers get away with mind control, simply by quoting some gospel or other and then seducing believers with their personal charisma. So what do we mean by magical thinking? According to the dictionary, magical thinking is, quote, the fallacious attribution of causal relationships between actions and events. That's a mouthful. The fallacious attribution, in other words, the false attribution of causal relationships between actions and events. In other words, imagining cause and effect between two possibly unrelated things. Now, magical thinking can run the gamut from the personal to the institutional. In certain New Age circles, for example, as well as in Christian Science, it's sometimes suggested that negative thinking is the sole cause for physical illness, leaving out biochemistry and environment and chance and so on. Now, while it's true that the quality of our thinking does affect health, of course, magical thinking can also have chilling results, as when it supposes that we have more power than we actually do have. For example, back in the 1980s, certain New Age teachers were suggesting that people with AIDS had elicited their own infection through their negative thinking, which to me made about as much sense as not stepping on a line in the sidewalk because you thought it would kill your mother. I saw many, many people back then who were already sick adding extra pain to their lives by believing that it was their own fault. And that is the shadow side of magical thinking. And then, of course, there's the positive side of magical thinking, the notion that we can manifest things outside ourselves simply by focusing enough positive energy or affirmation. While this is an appealing idea, the promise that it offers is also quite problematic. I first encountered this myself when I was a kid. I was about 13 years old, and I was at an ice cream parlor with a friend, and we were approached by this very pretty woman who told us that we could chant for our own happiness if we just came to one of her meetings. And since both of us were pretty unhappy teenagers, we jumped at this opportunity, and we followed her to a meeting of this Buddhist sect that believes in chanting a 4-word mantra to a wooden box on the wall over and over for hours on end, and that this magic box, which symbolized the mystic heart of the universe, would actually grant our wishes. We heard testimonies from people who found $100 bills at the laundromat after chanting for money, or located their own stolen cars, or been given free vacations, all thanks to repeating this mantra to the holy box on the wall. Books like The Secret promise that we can manifest anything through positive thinking and visualization. But this is a very slippery slope. While it's true that we do create our experience of reality through our thoughts, the idea that we can affirm or imagine or chant things into existence is hard to substantiate. Very often, this turns out to be much more of a dream wish, an oversimplification of reality, than it is something that can be proved. In truth, we cooperate with external reality. We do not create it. Some of you may disagree with this, and I do hope you'll speak up at the end of the talk today or post your comments on the site. I'm only speaking from my own experience. Personally, I have never seen anyone pull a rabbit from a hat, except in a magic act. And I've never seen anybody manifest anything in their lives out of thin air simply by wishing hard enough. We can contribute to things happening, of course. And sometimes extraordinary, uncanny events do occur synchronistically. But this happens according to laws and interrelationships that transcend the limits of our personal will. We can sometimes affect outcomes by the quality of our thoughts and desires, but we can never control those outcomes for the obvious reason that we are not God. We partake of God. We're riding with God, you could say, but we're not in the driver's seat. And that's the whole point of spiritual life, to acknowledge that we're not in control, not by any stretch. And this awareness puts us in contact with a new kind of harmony, a different kind of wisdom, a strength that comes through surrender. We learn to take every action possible toward the good without imagining that we know what will actually happen or what should happen. And that's what spiritual detachment means. As a friend of mine used to say, being totally committed and completely unattached. Totally committed, completely unattached. Now, that's an idealized version of how to relate to our own lives for the vast majority of us. But it is a helpful paradox to live with, to be totally committed and completely unattached. Now, magical thinking is often adaptive. It helps us to survive. It's how we learn to live with the hand that we're dealt. Like all storytelling, magical thinking helps us inhabit our own circumstances. And this can be poignant, even when it's hard to believe. For instance, a friend of mine lost her husband a few years back. And as somebody who was fully steeped in New Age thought, she found a lot of comfort in imagining that her husband wasn't actually dead, even though she had seen him buried in the ground. After his death, she sort of floated through her life, telling herself these fantastical stories to keep from facing the depth of her own loss. If you've read Joan Didion's classic book about her own husband's death, The Year of Magical Thinking, you know what I'm talking about. Even a hard-headed agnostic like Joan Didion found herself unable to remove her husband's shoes from the doormat 6 months after he died, right in front of her, for fear that he might need them if he came home. In my own friend's case, she moved through her newly widowed days making connections and locating signs that she actually believed were real. One day we were sitting in a restaurant talking about an important decision that she needed to make, but she kept putting off. And right at that very moment, a light on the wall next to us started to flicker. And when that happened, she said, "Thank you, Mike," speaking to her dead husband. She felt that he'd finally given her the answer. She was finally able to make her choice because he'd given her permission. So in that moment, a blip in the power line became, for my friend, in her dark night, the voice of wisdom from beyond. As Joan Didion describes in the book, she says, quote, "There was a level on which I believed that what had happened remained reversible." Okay? Her husband had died, but there was a level at which she believed that this was reversible. And this is the essence of magical thinking and the power of the imagination, which we're going to get to in a moment. Now, when religions and institutions use magical thinking to create stories for followers to live by, they can cut both ways as well. Group mythologies, religions, gospel can lead to wonderful solidarity and purpose, as you see when Christians do missionary work that aids the poorest of the poor, believing that they're doing the work of Jesus, or the belief in salvation that can sustain so many people. But, of course, these mythologies also lead very often to terrible things, to tribalism, to bloodshed, and to the horrors that we see around the planet. Magical thinking empowers institutions to manipulate the least among us for their own sake by telling us that if we do such and such, we will get so and so, that A will equal B, whether or not they can prove it. And this can be a terrible double bind. And it also becomes much more confusing because once we have a magical belief, we tend to live as if it's true and thus reflect it in our actions. Okay, so it becomes a question of the chicken or the egg, which comes first, the belief or what we're manifesting in our outer lives. Just going back to Christianity for a moment. If you believe that Christ has redeemed you and you improve your ways, you may imagine that Christ did this, when in fact it may have been your idea of Christ, imitating that did it. You may ask why accuracy matters here. What's the difference what story you use to get there if it leads you to being kinder or having more compassion? If magical thinking creates the desired effect, what's the difference if we may be, playing a head game with ourselves? That same logic can be applied to magical thinking as it pertains to death. Who cares if heaven and hell is a myth? What difference does it make if it helps us get through the night? Because at the end of the day, if it's true, then you've been right all along. If it wasn't true, then you've managed to comfort yourself in the face of your own extinction and given yourself a life of faith. And that afterwards, you're dead anyway, and no one's any the worse for it. So to argue against magical thinking, it really is hopeless. That's the truth. Because we all do it to smaller or lesser degrees. We create causation where it may not exist. And then we manifest what we believe to be true. We can't rid ourselves entirely of magical thinking, but we can exercise quality control. We can ask ourselves, what is the thrust of our own magical thinking? Okay, what effects do we manifest due to the myths that we tell ourselves about causes and effects? What stories do we tell ourselves, and how deluded or delusional are they? Personally, I think it's entirely possible as a human being to tell yourself a story and be aware of doing so at the same time. Okay? We can keep a chink of light open on uncertainty and not knowing. Maintain a level of healthy skepticism instead of drinking the Kool-Aid of our own delusions, our own stories. The trouble with storytelling and mythologizing only arises when we take our stories to be the absolute truth, okay, and then we build an identity around them. When that happens, it's very easy to become fanatical and fundamentalist, and to be willing to commit atrocities in the name of defending that identity, that faith. That's the shadow side of magical thinking, and it's been the cause of every genocide in history. Genocide always comes down to race or religion, differences in tribal mythology. And that's why magical thinking needs to be looked at very carefully. When I spoke to Eckhart Tolle a few years ago, he called this collective insanity, this tribal mythology, this habit of labeling one another, labeling someone as other, and then sort of putting a target on their back as us or them. When you do that, it becomes possible to murder each other's label and forget that they're actually people. This is magical thinking at its worst, and that's why it's so crucial to see its roots in ourselves. Because when we believe bad stories, very often we create bad actions. So ask yourself, how does magical thinking operate in your own life? What fantasy beliefs get you through the night? Are these stories doing you good? Or are they interfering with seeing things as they are? Or are you too enmeshed in your own beliefs to be sure? This is really important stuff to contemplate in the seeker's life. There is an argument to be made, and most Buddhist teachers and most non-dual teachers would press this point, that any story interferes with awakening. That delusion should be uprooted wherever we find it, no matter how benign it might be. And that we're ultimately ignorant if we cling to our myths, if we ignore our own deep experience and sort of whistle while Rome burns. In an absolute sense, I don't doubt that this is true, but I'm not talking about absolutes today. An absolute may be another fantasy. I'm interested in how we, as relative imperfect people, cope with mystery in the actual day-to-day reality of our uncertain lives. Speaking personally, as a young seeker, I was far more attached to spiritual absolutes than I am today. And in truth, I used to use my own spiritual zeal, my enthusiasm, to be pretty cruel sometimes. Because I used to feel like it was our duty to one another to expose and explode each other's delusions and entrapments. But of course, that's just arrogance. And that arrogance is antithetical to spiritual wisdom. Spiritual wisdom dictates a more nuanced approach to magical thinking and how to live as creatures with the gift of the imagination. This gift of the imagination is our ace in the hole. It helps us to create and imagine our own lives, to invent our own lives, and to make leaps of faith when it's necessary. But we want to know what those leaps of faith are, why we're doing it, and be aware that they are not the absolute truth. So here's a few useful questions to ask yourself to gauge your own relationship to magical thinking. Number one, do you get defensive when your beliefs are questioned? Number two, which beliefs do you consider sacrosanct and beyond questioning? Number three, do you tell yourself stories that disempower you, such as New Age ideas about thoughts and disease that I was describing to you? Number four, do you beat yourself up for not being able to manifest what you think you should be able to manifest? That's a big one. And finally, when does magical thinking create conflict in you? And when does it create conflict in you? Also, magical thinking affects our relationship to God. So ask yourself, how does magical thinking affect your relationship to the divine, to source, to the absolute? This is very important. How do you conceptualize God, and what magical powers do you ascribe to God? And what are your bargaining strategies with God? What are your rescue fantasies with God? The reason that this matters so much is that magical thinking may be causing you to put power outside yourself or beyond your own reach that's actually within you. You may be waiting for signs and wonders to give you permission, for the stars to be in perfect alignment before you move forward. If you discover this to be true, it doesn't mean that you deny the power of God as you know God. It just means realizing that this thing that you're telling yourself is a story, that you may be indulging in magical thinking. As long as you do that, as long as you remain your own witness, the guardian of your own deep truth, the self that isn't hoodwinked by the fantasies of the mind, then storytelling is just fine. It's how we can have faith without becoming victims of our own delusion. Okay, we choose to have faith because it helps us. Okay, we choose to imagine possibility and hope and healing and communion because we know that by doing so, we invite those qualities into our lives. We recognize that imagination is a divine gift that only we possess, but that imagination is not the prime mover. Faith is the bird that feels the light and sings while the dawn is still dark, wrote the Indian poet Tagore. Faith is the bird that feels the light and sings while the dawn is still dark. The bird knows, to the degree that birds actually think, that its song isn't making the sun come up. It just sustains the bird's cold body until the light does appear in the sky. That is not an insignificant thing, and neither are the light-giving stories that we live by, because faith is real to the degree that it's real for us. But beyond that, no one can possibly know for sure. That's really the point I'd like you to take away from this talk today. Let there be a crack between your magical thinking and the absolute truth, knowing that they are not the same thing. And when you have that, you can be your own master, and you can know when to move beyond myths and stories that are no longer serving you, okay, or that are leading you in directions that don't feel spiritually nutritious and wholesome for you. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about magical thinking and delusion, and I would love to hear from you. I have no doubt that some of you disagree with a lot of what I said today, and I'd love to hear from you if you'd like to share.